A warm welcome, everyone, at our policy dialogue on EU-Africa cooperation on migration. We're very pleased to see that so many of you have joined us today. We have over 250 participants who have registered. My name is Matthias. I'm heading the Migration and Diversity team at the European Policy Center, and I'm joined by Matthias Lücke, Senior Researcher at the Kiel Institute for the World Economy and Coordinator of the MEDAM project, by Olivia Sundberg, Diez, Policy Analyst in the Migration Program of the European Policy Center, and by Raül Hernández y Sagrera, member of the Cabinet of Commissioner for Home Affairs, Ylva Johansson, where he works, amongst other things, on the external dimension of EU migration policy making. We'll be looking today, as the title already highlights, at the future of EU cooperation on migration with African stakeholders and countries. As a new Commission has taken office, it has on a number of occasions already reiterated its commitment to building a true partnership of equals with African countries and stakeholders. But how exactly does it best move forward in this respect? What, for instance, can it learn from the experiences of the past Commission or of the past EU legislature more broadly? What are the areas to continue focusing on? Where can we find, or where can we identify also room for improvement in comparison to the past? Looking at policy issues substantively as well, how to whet a strong EU focus also from the side of the member states on return, readmission and border control policies with potentially differing interests from the side of African states. How should we set an increased focus on conditionality from the European side, particularly and for instance in visa arrangements or in the context of development aid? How can the EU make good on its promises to increase legal pathways to Europe? What should such pathways look like, and how can we make sure that they are sufficiently credible, accessible and visible? In short, a number of questions that we can jointly address this afternoon on how European and African perspectives can come together as best as possible on migration. This discussion also marks the launch of our MEDAM Yearly Assessment Report, jointly written by the three MEDAM project partners, the Kiel Institute of the World Economy, the Migration Policy Center of the European University Institute in Florence, and the European Policy Center, and kindly supported as well by the Mercator Foundation. You can find the report on the website of MEDAM, and you can also download it following the link that has appeared on your chat boxes. Part of the analysis for this report was conducted in Europe through desk research and interviews. Other parts, particularly on the perspectives from the African side, were conducted through fieldwork, interviews and participatory workshops and stakeholder consultations in Niger, Nigeria, Senegal and Gambia by a team that was made up of both European and African researchers. On behalf of the EPC, I would like to warmly thank our partners for the fruitful cooperation on this report. Matthias will also follow up with some further insights on the project itself. I would also like to thank very much our colleagues from the Connecting Europe project who have joined us in hosting this discussion. Connecting Europe is a joint initiative of the Mercator Foundation and the European Policy Center, seeking to connect civil society and research organizations with decision makers and the policy community in Brussels. Before we start our discussion, a final few words from my end with housekeeping notes. To begin with, this is a public discussion. It is recorded and it will also later be published online. We are also very much looking forward to hearing from you, the audience. And after first short opening statements by the panelists and then a round of comments and questions between them, we will also open the floor to questions from the audience. In order to ask a question, please either raise your hand by clicking the green hand button that is on your right hand side. Instead, or alternatively, you can also write down your question in the box marked questions, both in raising your questions orally or in putting them forward in writing. I would like to ask you to please keep them as focused and concise as possible. That's it for now from my end, and then I'm happy to pass over the floor to Matthias Lücke, who will be providing some further insights into the MEDAM project.
Thank you very much, Marie. Let me just be very brief because I stand between everybody and Olivia's presentation, and that's an awkward place, but let me just say that MEDAM is an international research alliance that is based at the 3 partner institutions that Marie has mentioned: the European Policy Center in Brussels, the Migration Policy Center at the European University Institute in Florence, and the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, where this project is also coordinated. And we have major financial support from Stiftung Mercator, which is a large private foundation in Germany. In this, concerning the substance of our work, throughout we apply a whole of system approach to analyzing migration and migration policies. Let me just illustrate that potential migrants decide to migrate or not to migrate based on their own socioeconomic circumstances, their willingness to take risks perhaps, the current conditions and their prospects in the home country, their expected future lives in alternatives countries of destination, those countries' immigration policies, and of course the cost of migrating to alternative destination countries, either regularly or irregularly. So this is really a complex system that is described as a migration system. And when governments seek to influence migration, they really need to bear all these factors in mind, or else there is a risk that any policies to influence migration outcomes will not be effective. As MEDAM Mercator Dialogue on Asylum and Migration, we focus on policies for asylum and migration at the EU level, and also at the interactions of those European policies with member state policies and practices. And we don't just do academic research, although we also do that. We also reach out to stakeholders, like through this webinar and many other events formats that we've had in the past in person, and future online formats that we hope to develop. And we seek to introduce insights from our analysis into ongoing policy debates. This is what will happen here. So I'm very happy we can hold this webinar with such a large number of participants under such very special circumstances. And I do hope that our conversation will continue, of course, virtually for the time being, but in person whenever circumstances allow again. So let me hand back to Marie, and I'm looking forward to the presentation.
Thank you very much, Matthias. We seem to have lost Raül, but I'm sure that our events team in the background is working hard to make sure that he joins us again in a minute. In the meantime, I'm happy to pass the floor to Olivia, who will be moving us into the content of the report and some of the key message to be taken forward from the research that was conducted.
Brilliant. Thank you to both Maria and Matthias for the kind introduction. Indeed, I was involved in drafting the assessment report of 2020. The focus of the report was to evaluate and to make recommendations on the EU's cooperation with African countries on migration management. And one of the areas of focus was the EU's effort to increase the number of returned migrants without permission to remain in the EU. One of the ways that the EU does so is through a growing use of conditionality on third countries, namely making certain policy areas like development aid, visas, or refugee resettlement contingent on countries' cooperation on readmission. Now, the assessment report, of course, is broader than this, but I thought it would be interesting to mention 3 points that the report raises about this particular trend of conditionality for readmission. The first point is that conditionality has not been very effective in the past few years, at least not regarding readmission. The rate of returns remains relatively constant across the EU, even with countries where conditionality has been used. This is for a range of reasons. In part, it is because the incentives offered have not been large enough or credible enough. In part, because third countries have many strong reasons to not want to cooperate on returns, including the economic costs and the political costs of readmission. And there are also a wide range of other obstacles to migrants being returned, including legal obstacles, administrative problems, as well as issues with the reliability of return figures. So all of these limitations are not going anywhere in future readmission cooperation. In fact, they may be further complicated by the fact that the EU is losing some leverage with countries of origin and transit in Africa. Other regions such as China, Russia, and the Middle East, as well as regional integration within Africa, are coming to play a larger role. So, in short, conditionality has not had a very big impact on return and readmission. However, there's the second point that I want to make, which is that the report does warn that conditionality has a broader impact beyond migration policy. To begin with, conditionality can impact the EU's relations with third countries. African diplomats, as well as academics, have often raised their frustration with the attention that is given to readmission, which is highly unpopular domestically, at the expense of policies like development, remittances, or developing legal pathways. They also express feeling pressured by the EU's use of conditionality and a lack of ownership over their migration policies as a result. Now, the new Commission, as Marie stated, has often stressed that it wants to develop a more sustainable relationship with African partners, and to quote President von der Leyen, a true partnership of equals. Now, this is very welcome and certainly very necessary, but the use of conditionality can undermine this in practice. Secondly, within this point, conditionality also risks undermining other policy goals. It entails a shift in how development assistance or resettlement, for example, are allocated and how they are evaluated. There have been many reports, for example, of development aid under the EU Trust Fund being diverted away from the countries where it was most needed or most effective to the countries with the highest migration relevance. And this trend makes certain policy goals, which are important in their own right, such as development aid or resettlement, less effective. So given this, the report argues that the EU should weigh these costs, take these factors into account when considering the use of a conditionality approach in the future. In particular, since conditionality may not be fully effective in increasing the rate of return. There is a third point that the report mentions, which is that we may be seeing a turn towards a more punitive use of conditionality, or so-called less for less conditionality. Some states have been calling for this, and this is also reflected, for example, in the new visa code. The idea here is that rather than offering new incentives for cooperation, member states would increasingly take existing policies or engagement away if third countries do not cooperate enough on readmission, for example. And this is more concerning still. To begin with, it may be counterproductive and further harm relations with third countries. When the EU's partners are not given space in negotiations to claim wins or to present any benefits of readmission cooperation domestically, this limits the room for maneuver politically and makes cooperation with the EU more unpopular. At the same time, this approach risks creating vicious cycles of less for less, so to speak. What do I mean here? The risk is that states with the least developed reception systems and who are the least able to take in returnees would also be the ones who receive the least EU support to improve those systems. Now, these 3 points are only a summary of only some of the findings of the assessment reports, but based on this, the report does make a few recommendations. In general, it argues that the EU should be paying more attention to third countries' interests, to domestic dynamics, and to public opinion, and that it should listen more carefully to what African partners want. And one of the things that we call for, just to conclude, is for developing legal pathways that are visible, credible, and accessible. The report argues that this would benefit African citizens, it would strengthen African economies, and at the same time, it would be a meaningful step towards a holistic and sustainable partnership on migration.
Thank you very much, Olivia. Raül has let us know in the chat that he is still there, which is fantastic news. The webcam, however, does not work, but hopefully the microphone does. So over to you, Raül. We look forward to hearing your remarks on the report and also learning more generally about the Commission's priorities in the context of its relations on migration with African partners.
Thank you very much, Marie. I hope that you can hear me.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
And, yes, I see that the camera is trying to connect, but it doesn't succeed in that. So I will speak like on the radio. I would like to thank you very much for organizing this webinar, to thank in particular the European Policy Center, but also all the organizations within MEDAM. And I would also like to congratulate you on the publication of this report yesterday. It is a very timely report assessing the external dimension of migration, but with a particular focus on Africa. And I say very timely because the Commission adopted and the High Representative a joint strategy, a strategy for Africa on the 9th of March, which outlines the main, let's say, elements of the EU approach towards migration in Africa. I will refer very briefly to the main elements in the Africa strategy, which are actually covered in the messages, in the recommendations of the report, and then make a very close a link with the report. When it was adopted, as I said, on the 9th of March, and it was adopted a few weeks, a few days after the first, a college-to-college meeting between the European Commission and the African Union Commission, which actually saw the biggest delegation ever of the College of the European Commission outside the European Union. So this shows the importance of building a strategic partnership with Africa of this commission. And relating to what you said, Marie, on how it relates to the previous commission, the main overarching element of the Africa strategy when it comes to migration and mobility is the partnership approach on migration and mobility, which comes from the previous commission. Which was developed in 2016, and which is based on addressing in a joint manner and based on our joint interests the challenges and opportunities arising from migration. This includes areas, also referring to what Marie said, which are on the one hand first supporting the refugee communities and internally displaced people in Africa. Let's not forget that sub-Saharan Africa hosts about a quarter of the refugee population in the world. So the European Union, the Commission commits to continue supporting both the refugees and host communities in Africa. Then a second element is continue working on, let's say, reducing irregular migration, but focused on the readmission cooperation, but not only, because there is the notion of preventing irregular migration in the Africa strategy, and by that there is an element which is essential and which is addressed jointly between the European Union and third countries, which is the fight against smuggling. This is essential. Now I see that I'm back. So the fight against smuggling is part of, let's say, the efforts to reduce irregular migration, and this places really at the heart of the cooperation and the protection of migrants. And then there are many other areas which are part of this fight against irregular migration, addressing irregular migration, which are providing capacity building to third countries in the area of migration management. And one final element is that of legal pathways, which is mentioned also in the Africa strategy. And by legal pathways, we refer in particular to legal migration, and how legal migration can be further promoted as a way, let's say, to promote labor migration into the EU. So these are the elements which, let's say, we put forward as Commission a few weeks ago, and in particular to be addressed jointly with Africa. In particular, regarding the different, just to, as a matter of conclusion, because I know that I have to be brief for this introduction. The first message was on partnership approach. So this is actually what this is about agreeing jointly with our African partners on our migration cooperation. Then when it comes to readmission, as I mentioned, it is part of a wider cooperation to address irregular migration, which includes in particular the fight against smuggling and provision of capacity building. When it comes to the third recommendation about the notion of remittances and irregular migration, one thing which is essential, and this is probably more addressed in another section of the Africa strategy, is the commitment to work together with Africa in promoting economic development. And this is something that was already addressed last year in the Global Alliance on jobs and investment. Legal migration, I already referred to legal migration as being an area for joint cooperation, also the protection of refugees. And they mentioned that the College of the European Commission was visiting Addis Ababa in February. Ethiopia, it's hosts a bit less than 1 million of refugees coming from other countries. And one issue that we discussed with the Ethiopian authorities is precisely our support and our joint efforts to support this refugee population. So I will leave it at there. Just to mention one element that I see now that I forgot on when talking about returns, and it is the voluntary returns, which are also referred to in the strategy, and where we see some positive developments like the ones that took place in the context of the from Libya to their countries of origins in the countries of the trilateral task force between the European Union, the UN, and the African Union. And I leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Raül. I'll be happy to move back to Olivia and or to Matthias if he wants to come in as well. So we received a very comprehensive and rich overview from Raül. Be happy to learn a bit from Olivia. When we match that with the research, where do we see matches and or mismatches with what we've learned from African perspectives? What were some of the surprising findings, perhaps, from the report in that respect? So happy to have a reaction to Raul's presentation, and then of course Raül, I'll also move back to you to respond in turn if you'd like to.
Certainly, that's a very good question, and I think the African perspective is certainly worth going into a little bit more. Here, I will speak somewhat on behalf of Franziska Zanker and Leonie Jegen, who were part of the research team on West African attitudes specifically. So I'm borrowing some of their words and some of their research. And to briefly introduce their work that they did for the report, it bears mentioning what Marie highlighted before as well, that the research aimed precisely to be very participatory. So it was very reliant on 130 interviews in West Africa, dissemination events in West Africa, consultation with stakeholders there. So the focus is grounded very much in the political interest and the societal discourse in West Africa. So based on that, it was interesting to hear the overview of the different developments at play, Raül, specifically from the EU perspective. The way these have been viewed in West Africa in the past, and of course bearing in mind that there's a very wide range of different voices and views throughout the region. On one hand, there are some benefits of EU-African cooperation on migration. Certain elements like the increased funding of migration-related development projects have certainly been welcomed, but at the same time, there are certain questions that have been raised. For example, regarding migration governance, partnerships with the EU have had adverse effects on the local ownership and increased conflicts over institutional mandates of migration policy. And there have been concerns, for example, in Niger and Senegal over donors' ability to set the agenda of migration policy. The most contentious issue has probably been return and readmission. And I touched on this before, but in West Africa, this has often been seen as entangled in domestic legitimacy problems and concerns about potentially reduced remittances, for example, in Gambia or Nigeria. And this is what makes it very difficult for states in the region to comply with forced returns in particular. What this means then, from the Western African perspective, is that many stakeholders stress that the current approach is not working and that certain things need to change. So there's two recommendations that they make in particular. One of them is that there needs to be a change in narrative, and the EU needs to actually listen to the interests and to the concerns voiced by states, by civil society organizations, and by migrant groups in West Africa. There's this perspective of migration in the EU that often frames it as a problem to be curtailed, and this stands in very strong contrast to a different and a diverse understanding of migration and mobility in West Africa, which sees it predominantly as an important livelihood strategy. So from this perspective, maybe we need to have a broader discussion of migration that reflects the multiple interests and positions and doesn't always put readmission and stemming smuggling and irregular migration at the core of EU summits and at the core of the joint strategy on Africa. And a second recommendation, which I mentioned before, is making legal migration pathways more than just rhetoric. As I mentioned before, these should be accessible, visible, and credible. So what this means is that there are certain problems that need to be addressed, like not being able to apply for a Schengen visa in all African countries, a low probability of success in applications, for example. They should be visible so that people can see positive examples of people migrating in a safe and orderly manner. And perhaps most importantly, they need to be credible, right? So not only a handful of people benefit from such programs. Between 2014 and 2018, and I find this quite telling, the number of Nigerians who got a scholarship from Erasmus Plus was 84. Now that's a minuscule fraction of the population. So one question that I find that I would be very keen to hear your thoughts on, Raül, is obviously there's efforts on the EU side to increase these legal migration pathways. How much is being done concretely? How much more can be done in the future? What opportunities can we take advantage of? Because, and to raise a very final point here, Marie, you mentioned where are the matches and mismatches. And I do think that, of course, the EU's approach has been placed on return and readmission, among other areas. One of the things that the report suggests, the assessment report, is that when these conditions are in place, like better legal pathways, a better discourse on migration, African governments will also be in a better position to contribute to those areas, to cooperate on return and readmission. So hopefully this is not necessarily an area where finding common ground is impossible.
Thank you very much, Olivia. I'd be happy to move the floor back to Raül to maybe give us a few remarks, if you would like, on some of the points raised.
You can hear me directly, huh? Yeah. Thanks, Olivia. Yes. Indeed, you talk about this narrative, but this narrative, in my view, is there from the point of view that every, let's say, action or specific policy area on migration is part of the overall dialogue that the EU has with a certain partner. So let's say, when I talked about this comprehensive approach to migration and about building these partnerships are part of a comprehensive approach to other areas. And it is part of the negotiation between the EU and the third partner based on their mutual interests. Some countries that I have worked directly on in my previous experience in the Commission, for example, Morocco, or all the countries in the southern, and there were discussions on agreeing on partnership priorities as part of the rollout of the European Neighbourhood Policy. And if you look at these partnership priorities, which are bilateral agreed documents, you can see that in all cases, there is a section on one of these partnership priorities is effectively migration. And that text was tailor-made based on the mutual interest between the EU and the third country. So, and talking about now the specific part, migration is one of them, readmission is one of them, and in my presentation I highlighted also other major policy areas. So within and not only the work of the European Commission is doing to support third countries in
Raül, we seem to be losing you. The sound, I don't know if you can hear this, but maybe one idea could be for you to turn off your camera, and perhaps that will direct the internet to your sound.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
So I was saying,
you seem to have spoken too soon.
You hear me?
I hear you again, please.
You cannot hear me? Yeah.
I hear you.
Okay. 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 So I was saying that there is, for example, a lot of work concerning supporting capacity building in the area of migration management. And this includes not only the strategies, related migration strategies for the country, also support for third countries to develop their own asylum capacities. This is, for example, done in the context of the regional development and protection programs. Just to give you a bit an overview of the wide array of policies that we have within the area of migration. And of course, one which is key is that of legal migration. And here we have now been working on what we call the pilot projects with certain countries, including Nigeria. This is some programs that are, as the word says, pilot. So let's say it's a way to test in how far we can go in the area of legal migration. And we implement this with the support of the International Center for Migration Policy Development as part of the Mobility Partnership Facility. And there is there an element of matching between labor shortages or labor needs in specific sectors in the EU, and where partner countries can have an interest in getting the talent, getting the skills then in the EU for that particular sector. So there is a potential for further development. And as you can see, as I referred to the principle that legal migration is a key area for cooperation in the Africa strategy.
Thank you very much, Raül, and for bearing with us while the system was having some hiccups. Matthias highlighted to me that he briefly like to make a few points as well. So over to you, Matthias, and then we'll move the discussion also into some of the more recent developments.
Well, very briefly, maybe, of course, we are very happy to see that the Commission is doing a lot of things that we have identified as steps in the right direction. What we do here from our research in West Africa is that there needs to be a lot more work until all of this filters down to the ground, and there is clearly room for more work here. I would also like to add that, of course, legal pathways means to a large extent legal labor migration, and this brings in the member states. So it's not something that the Commission can do all on its own, but it's really there's a need for conversation with the member states to ensure that they create opportunities where legal migration can take place as migration into the labor market, and where this is supported in a way that makes sure that people are actually able to contribute productively. And the counterpart to that may well be that there needs to be a lot more training, a lot more vocational training, skills training offered in countries of origin to make sure that there is no brain drain and that we don't cream off the most skilled workers, and that there is training for both those who will go to European labor markets and for those who will stay at home, so that the skill base is not eroded. So there's a lot of work to be done, and it's not only the Commission that is called upon here, but also the member states.
Thank you, Matthias. I can't see Raül anymore, but that's for the better, because then at least we can hear him. But Raül, as you have difficulty signaling to me, just start speaking if you want to come in. But in the meantime, I would like to also take us into what has been happening most recently, and questions that I believe are on everyone's minds. More specifically, what is the impact of the current pandemic and the COVID crisis that we are experiencing on some of the dynamics and the developments that we are discussing? We know resettlement is affected, we know that return policies are affected, we know remittances are affected. So very happy to hear from you, Raül, what the Commission is doing in this respect. I'm monitoring strategies, but also maybe already some policies towards the future. And then also afterwards to have some views from Olivia and Matthias if they want to come in. Raül?
Yes, you can hear me well?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
Not just to echo what Matthias said, indeed, let's say legal migration is something that the Commission has to encourage very much, or encourages in conjunction with member states, because the competence on, as you said, on who has the right to work in each of the member states is with the member states. So it's a joint effort between both the Commission and member states. When it comes to resettlement, and this is also a legal pathway, of course, and what the EU or the Commission in particular tries to do is to continue supporting the different member states to resettle more and more vulnerable refugees, and we know we do that together with UNHCR. I would like to mention now something more to contextualize the current cooperation with third countries with COVID-19 and the specific situation that we are now living. And here the Commission adopted a global response to COVID-19, in which there is a clear reference to continue supporting outside the European Union the most vulnerable, including migrants, refugees, and internally displaced persons. So that was adopted on the 8th of April. And it is, as I said, a priority in all the support that the Commission or that the EU provides worldwide to come to fight COVID-19, to focus in particular in the most vulnerable.
Thank you very much. I'll move over to Olivia for a few comments.
Of course, happy to add to that. Of course, as Raül mentioned, the implications of COVID-19 have been very significant and across a very broad range of areas. Indeed, resettlement has been significantly affected already. UNHCR and IOM, of course, announced a few weeks ago that resettlements would be suspended. So now the question is how and when to restart it, so to minimize delays and ensure that the most vulnerable refugees are supported quickly. I guess one point I would add here is that looking forward, resettlement is likely to be all the more important in the long term. In the context of the pandemic, border closures are likely to continue for quite some time. International movements are likely to be restricted long term. So ways to reach Europe safely will be further compromised, and refugees may be trapped in involuntary immobility more than ever, as it were. So I would say that we should be taking steps as much as possible now already in Europe to ensure that systems are in place to address this afterwards, both at the Commission level in coordinating and of course at member states. And in particular to ensure that systems like resettlement and legal pathways are upheld later as well, if the pandemic spreads elsewhere. For the moment, the epicenter has been in Europe and the US, but of course there's the possibility that we will see more cases in Africa, in the African continent in the coming months. So in that case, this should not put a halt on resettlement and on other migration pathways from the continent. Quite the contrary, because of course, other forms of war and persecution will continue. But then the thinking has to start already now, and the EU should be playing a strong role in managing and preempting this issue and coordinating closely with other countries to make sure that these policies can continue. And I'll mention maybe a second point, which is that of course, the pandemic has very clearly highlighted EU economy's dependence on migrant workers in key sectors, especially agriculture and especially healthcare. So looking forward, I would say that this strengthens the case for more legal pathways in the future. But at the same time, it shows the vulnerability of migrants working in these sectors and the need to increase protections, including for migrant workers who continue to have an irregular status. So there have been some very positive initiatives from certain member states in this area to expand work permits, to guarantee migrants access to services. And these are welcomed, and it would be very positive, I think, if other member states took similar measures. And one final point I will mention, of course, is that there is a very big economic impact of COVID-19, and the job losses and the impending global recession are bound to have a highly negative impact on remittances. In fact, just yesterday, the World Bank said that global remittances are projected to decline by 20% in the next year as a result of the economic crisis induced by COVID-19 and the shutdown. Migrants may be losing their job, they may be excluded from government support, they may struggle to send remittances even if they're still in work. The volatility in markets means that the exchange rate may be more expensive. So all of these challenges mean that economies that rely heavily on remittances are going to need more support than ever. So indeed, quite a lot of challenges to be thinking about in the long term.
Thank you very much, Olivia. We've moved into the final 20 minutes of our webinar already. So I would like to open the floor to participation from the audience. I've received quite a few questions already in writing. Thank you very much for that. I can already tell that we won't be able to answer all of them, but I'll pick a few. And if you have any pressing questions for us later, don't hesitate to reach us via email. Perhaps I would like to give the floor first to Pietro Romano. Your name is already mentioned, but if you could briefly state your professional affiliation as well, and then we'll take 1 to 2 questions more before we move back to the panel. So Pietro, please feel free to raise your question. We'll wait a bit for Pietro to come in. Okay, that seems to be going a little bit slow, but helpfully Pietro has also provided his questions in writing, so I'll read them for us. The questions, there are in fact 2 questions, are for Raül. Question 1, how will the new pact on asylum and migration be linked to the EU-Africa strategy? How are you planning to involve CSOs in both processes, i.e. are you planning consultations with NGOs on the external dimension of the pact? So immediately 2 questions for Raül, but as mentioned, I'll first take a few more. Maybe over for another question to Inma Vasquez. Inma, could you come in, please?
Oh, okay. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so because Raül was referring to concrete action and the legal pathway, so we have one very concrete ask or call that the EU and he knows says on to find solutions for Libya at the moment for the migrants and refugees that are trapped there. So UNHCR and IOM programs at the moment are suspended. There is nothing. So, and this is also in relation, of course, with the growing of COVID cases and how the migrant and refugees population could be affected because they don't have access to healthcare, or they don't have access to the public health care facilities and don't have resources to go to the private ones. So yes, so this is one very concrete thing or aspect in which some actions, some discussions should be taking place now. In terms of the general resettlement and legal pathways, I mean, in the countries in which MSF is present in Africa, and we follow, although it's not the core of our work. Yes, I mean the protection mechanisms have been there or have been established since many years ago, but the bottleneck is still the resettlement and the resettlement places and the capacity to absorb the demand in Europe and elsewhere. And also in this protection, we have the impression that those stranded in Niger in this transit or emergency transit mechanism are sort of forgotten at the moment. And for those of Rwanda, it's just a few hundred, but yeah.
Thank you very much, Inma. I believe that was then a comment from MSF. I think that wasn't fully clarified in the beginning. A final brief question, maybe from Anaïs Voor. Anaïs, if you could briefly state your professional affiliation as well, and to keep it short, please, so we can have another round of questions and follow up. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm Anaïs Voor, working for the Red Cross EU office. Following the recommendation on opening a legal pathway and legal migration channels, we see that in the case of an existing legal channel, family reunification, which is an EU directive, a lot of the problems and obstacles faced by migrants in accessing this right are linked to concrete practical obstacles, including when it comes to accessing embassies and consulates abroad. So I was wondering whether, as part of the research, the MEDAM research, you had any specific recommendation in that regard. From our side, we view consular cooperation as a key way forward to make family reunification accessible. So my question was also to Raül to see whether there were any plans or any prospect for enhancing and improving such consular cooperation in the next years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anaïs. Raül, there were quite a few questions for you, so if you don't mind, I'll be happy to move to you first. I would like to ask all of my panelists to keep their answers as focused as possible so we can have another round of questions from the audience. Thank you. Raül?
Yes, can you hear me well? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much for all your questions. And I will start talking about resettlement and resettlement in the current context of the pandemic, in reply to the questions of Olivia and Dinma. And all I can say, of course, for the time being, UNHCR has stopped resettlements are difficult, but there is a guidance that was issued by the Commission last week, precisely to member states, and pointing to the fact that to the extent possible, resettlement should continue, and it should continue precisely to protect, because resettlement is a tool to allow, it's a legal pathway for those who are most vulnerable, and it is very, very relevant in the current context. So that is regarding what I wanted to say on resettlement. When it comes to the second question of Olivia on the difficulties regarding to unemployment that migrants within the EU may face in the aftermath of the current pandemic crisis, this is of course something that is key to reflect on, and is part of also the recovery plan and roadmap that the Commission is currently discussing together with member states. When it comes to the link between the Africa strategy and the Future Pact, of course, the Africa strategy is a very recent document which has a specific focus on Africa. The pact will cover the entire world, but of course there will be many elements. I mean, these are elements which are part of the ongoing discussions in preparation of the pact. As you can imagine, these are elements which are there, and consultations with CSOs have taken place and continue to take place on a bilateral and also multilateral way, let's say with meetings. Commissioner Johansson met CSOs based in Brussels, and also she has been meeting civil society organizations in most of the member states, because she has, as part of the consultations for the Future Pact, she has toured the entire member state. She has, in the first 3 months of the mandate, and in most countries, she has had meetings with civil society organizations on the pact, and covering also the external aspects. Finally, when it comes to the question from Anaïs from the International Committee of the Red Cross, here, what I would say about consular cooperation is that, of course, there is always a call from our side to improve consular cooperation in the current context of the pandemic, and also in these guidance, and I'm referring now to other guidance, the guidance on the non-essential travel to the EU. There we precisely make a call on member states to continue providing visa services in the current context.
Thank you, Raül, for very clear answers in a focused way. I'll move over to Olivia and/or Matthias to see if they want to add a few brief points before we move back to the audience.
Not much on my end. Only to say that unfortunately the assessment report didn't look very much specifically at family reunification or consular cooperation. So sorry to not be able to answer that question in more detail.
I'll be happy to then have another round with hopefully also 3 questions. To all people asking questions, please, again, do keep them short. I'll be moving first to Marco Funk, then to Sion Tadesse Abebe, and then I would like to also hear from Bert Parocel. Sorry for those whose questions I cannot take, but again, we'd be happy to be in touch via email. So over first to Marco. Oh, sorry, I unmuted you whilst I meant to unmute you.
Can you hear me?
Marco, now you should be able to be audible.
Okay, great. So yes, my name is Marco Funk. I work for the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Brussels. And I wanted to touch on a point that was mentioned previously regarding legal channels, which appear to be a main or major bargaining chip vis-a-vis third countries when it comes to negotiations, also concerning readmission. But given the current COVID crisis, I believe that the future of legal channels will be rather bleak. It was already quite difficult for member states to agree to open up significant legal channels before, but now, given the likely economic downturn and the complications resulting from the current situation, I could imagine that it will be even more difficult to encourage member states to agree to open up more legal channels. So given that, my question to the panelists would be, what other instruments would be likely or would be promising, let's say, to replace legal channels as a bargaining chip to encourage cooperation on readmission specifically with third countries? Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. I believe Bernd's question really follows up nicely from that. So I'll first move to Bernd, but I will not forget about Sion, to whom I will turn then after Bernd Parocel, whose name I'm looking now for unmuting. Voila. Oh, the unmuting is not going very well. Maybe the events team can help me with this.
Were you trying to unmute?
Bernd Parocel. But in the meantime, I've also found this.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, my question is very simple. I was just wondering whether the EU is acting, whether there's an equal interest among all member states in a more comprehensive cooperation on migration with Africa, or whether there are different interests between the member states. Basically, the question is the EU speaking with one voice, or are there several different interests involved? Thank you.
Thank you, Bernd. So then now over to Sion Tadesse Abebe. Voila, please do. Oh. Yeah, still waiting for the unmuting to take place. Voila, yeah, you should be able to raise your question now. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Ylva Abeba. I'm a senior researcher in migration, working for the Institute for Security Studies, a Pan-African institute. I'm based in Addis Abeba. I have a couple of questions. One, if you can help me understand what is really new in the new communique of the EU strategy as far as migration and mobility is concerned, because based on my reading, it's a continuation of the return and reintegration cooperations and the cooperations around refugees, which is mainly the implementation of the comprehensive refugees response framework, part of the global compact on refugees. So, and the legal pathways, as we know, is really, really limited. So what is really new? It's not well explained in your presentations. And the second point I want to raise is the EU Commission announced a $15.6 billion euros support to partners, including Africa, to fight COVID. How much of this is fresh money? It will be quite good to know. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. To switch things around a little bit, I'll be happy to first go to my MEDAM panelists, Olivia and Matthias, and then I'll leave the final word also to Raül, so you can answer, Raül, to some of the questions that were raised to you. Olivia?
I'll be happy to start. So first, thank you, Marco, for your question on what the economic downturn will mean for legal pathways and what alternative forms of leverage may exist. I have a couple of answers. The first one is, I'd question to what extent necessarily COVID-19 will have to mean that legal pathways shut down or, are significantly reduced. Of course, there's one view, which is there will be a smaller pie, and therefore member states and EU citizens may be willing to share it less. But conversely, as I mentioned earlier, there is a push for increasing legal pathways in view of the significant contribution that is coming from non-EU migrants in the EU. So it's too early to say what the conclusion of the COVID-19 pandemic will be for both legal and irregular migration. But I don't think it's an impossible battle to lose for those in favor of legal pathways. And of course, it depends. This will entail close cooperation with third countries to ensure, certain health standards are met, to ensure, limitations on the brain drain and other concerns. But I don't think it's necessarily impossible. The second part of my answer is that, of course, one of the reasons to continue pursuing legal pathways isn't only as leverage for return and readmission, but it's also valuable in its own right. So I think that is one reason to continue trying to make this argument. In terms of the actual question you asked, which is what other forms of leverage or what other ways to increase return and readmission exist, I suppose one of the conclusions you could draw from the assessment report is that there are certain aspects of return and readmission that are less controversial for third countries than others. For example, the EU has often insisted that third countries readmit nationals that are not their own nationals, but nationals of yet another third country. For example, when they transited through that country or not. That is a small portion of all returns, so perhaps focusing less on that and focusing more on countries accepting their own nationals is one way to increase returns further. Similarly, voluntary returns do not carry the same idea of coercion or the same pressure in third countries. So focusing on increasing voluntary returns could be a way to continue making progress in this area. So I hope that answers your question. And second, on the question from Bernd, indeed, you raise a very good point, which is that EU countries do not always speak with one voice when they deal with Africa, which is interesting because very often the concern has EU officials and EU voices have raised the concern that Africa does not always have one voice, where in fact it's the EU that very often is the most fragmented. Just to give one example, regarding the proposal for disembarkation platforms that happened in 2018, that happened led by specific member states and quite generally outside of the EU framework. These negotiations very often happen on a bilateral level between one EU member state and one African partner. So there are multiple ways in which this makes coordination more difficult and less systematic. One way in which this plays out, for example, regarding the use of conditionality in the future, is that while EU member states agree in principle on the need to use more leverage on third countries to increase the rate of return, very often they disagree when it comes to a specific third country. So Spain will be unwilling to cooperation with Morocco by imposing very harsh visa restrictions on it, for example. So it's an issue that we raise in the report, which is that member states will always be more willing in principle and in the abstract to employ conditionality, whether it's positive or negative, less for less or more for more, than they are when it is in practice. So indeed, this fragmentation will be another issue to handle.
Thank you, Olivia. Matthias, did you still want to come in before I move to Raül?
In the interest of time, can I suggest that Raül gets a chance to also talk about member states versus the Commission on Africa and the specific questions by Zion. So I suggest we turn it over to him.
Very good. Raül, and we'll then start concluding our webinar here. Very happy to hear from you what your answers are to some of the interesting points raised from the audience.
Thank you very much to all for all the questions and for the engaging debate. Replying to the question from the colleague from the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, legal pathways are part of legal channels, are part of a broader number of policy areas. We have not delved into mobility for example. We haven't discussed about visas, visa liberalization, visa facilitation, about the benefits of the visa code. We haven't discussed about the students. Erasmus Plus was mentioned by Olivia. So it is part of a much broader number of areas to cooperate. Regarding the EU-Africa relationship, whether there is we speak with one voice or not, I would say, I mean, the partnership approach, which has been ongoing for a few years now, and which is there, is something that I would say that both the EU and member states agree on. What you can see is that, of course, depending on the bilateral relationships that member states have with a specific with different partners in Africa, of course, that brings benefits in the sense that member states can have a given expertise in or dealing with specific member states. For example, we can think of our partnership with Morocco and the role that Spain plays in that partnership. If you think of the border management package or the migration management package that was adopted in late 2018, for example, where there's a component which is implemented by a Spanish agency. But just to give you an example, moving on to the question of what is new, from the colleague from Addis Abeba. What is new in the Africa strategy? Of course, many elements that you refer to are elements which existed before as part of the partnership approach, elements that we have been working on. Of course, what is the overall strategy brings a number of novelties. And also a new framework to cooperate with Africa, also including in the area of migration and consolidating different policies that we had already been working on. And finally, to reply on the question of the 15.6 billion euros that the Commission announced that would be secured and guaranteed to fight the pandemic worldwide. Of course, these funds are funds which are available, funds which in some cases are redirected from existing funding in order to address, for example, critical sectors in the context of the pandemic, which, like, for example, the health sector, and then more in the long term, also water and sanitation, and more in the long term, the economic recovery. So this is a bit the aim of this package. And finally, I wanted to say that on the 4th of May, the Commission will convene a pledging conference, which will be with countries also outside the European Union. That will be an international event convened by the Commission precisely to bring in more funding available to fight this pandemic.
Thank you very much, Raül, for these answers. With that, we have crossed 3 o'clock, so it's time, unfortunately, to conclude this very interesting dialogue. I would like to thank my 3 panelists, Olivia, Matthias, and Raül, very much for their engaging insights. I'd like to thank you all for joining us and for excellent questions from the audience. Keep well and safe, everyone, and we look forward to remaining in touch over the coming weeks and months. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.